Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the Orbital Pathfinder. Now, as to talk about my full review, this is probably my favorite release of 2025 so far, as it is a fully modular mouse that not only has 3000 plus shape configurations in its current form, it is also a very serviceable unit. So accessing the internals of the unit, modding things out is very easy to do so, and considering as this unit in particular does offer different shells and there is that side button issue I mentioned in my full review, I figured it'd be worthwhile to make a full video showing you guys how to take the mouse apart, reassemble it, as well as swap the shells and patch the side button issue. So we'll be doing all that in today's episode of Teardown. Now, before we get into it, as always, you will need a couple tools. Firstly, having a precision set of screwdriver bits will be very helpful. Now, most of the screws inside the Pathfinders are just Phillips heads, but they do vary in size, so having a couple different sizes will make your teardown process much easier. Also, having somebody to keep your mouse in place and keep track of your screws is also highly advisable. Now, I have this big silicone soldering mat, but you can use an ice cube tray and a microfiber cloth or pretty much whatever you want. Just make sure you have something to keep track of everything on the inside of the mouse. And if you want to patch the side button issue here on the Pathfinder, you will need some tape, preferably single-sided Scotch tape like this here. You can use other types that won't be as effective, so we recommend getting this kind of tape to do that as well, but that's only if you're going to patch the side buttons on your unit. But once you have all your tools, we can go ahead and start tearing down the Orbital Pathfinder. Alright, now unlike most mice when you go to take them apart, you don't actually need to remove the stock skates or any kind of aftermarket skates on your Pathfinder, which is a great thing to see, as in order to remove the top shell from the base shell, you actually have to remove this rail system here first. So we'll go ahead and start with that. Now to do this, you're going to go ahead and remove a screw from here and a screw from here. And then once that screw is removed, you go ahead and pull this straight up, and that is the rail attachment for the rear hump pieces. We can put this off to the side. And then you also want to pull out this little spring modular piece here that acts as kind of the latch for the rear attachment pieces. And then on the inside here, there is also a small little spring, which if you turn the unit over should just come right out, as you can see there. And make sure to put that off to the side, because if you lose that screw, your rear modular parts will no longer work. Once that's done, just to keep things easy, I would also recommend removing the side buttons, which you can do by just pinching them off. Like so. They can be a little finicky sometimes. And then once that's done, you want to basically just put a little pressure towards the rear side here, and you can pick the rear shell up, and you want to pick it up and over and push out the front of the mouse like this. Now make sure not to pull too far up, because you could damage your main clicks, as these stabilizers do hook into the onboard stabilizers here and here. So you just want to gently tilt it up and pull it forward until they come off, but just be careful you don't damage your main clicks. And once that's done, that is how you take apart the top shell and the base shell. It is very easy to do on the Pathfinder. Let's put the base shell off to the side for now, and we'll focus on the top shell first. Now the top shell here on the Pathfinder is pretty straightforward, as there's not really too much to do here aside from removing these main clicks here, which we can do so by removing a screw from here and a screw from here. And then with those screws removed, you can remove the main clicks by basically putting a thumb here and pressing down while pulling here, and with enough pressure they'll just pop right off. Just like that. And that is how you remove the main clicks from the top shell. And since the side buttons are anchored to the main board, that is everything for the top shell. It's actually very easy to take apart. So we'll put this off to the side for now, and we can focus on the base shell next. Alright, now for the base shell, while it does look a little complicated here, it is actually very easy to work on, which is a welcome change compared to most mice, but there are a couple things you do need to look out for. As you can see towards the back here, there is a very thin ribbon cable for the side buttons, and of course the battery's JST connector, which you will need to remove. Now you can remove the JST connector by just getting a fingernail under and pulling up towards the back here. You just need to be careful not to damage this ribbon cable. And for the ribbon cable, we can do the same thing, but we need to raise the two sides of its connector up, so you have to get your fingers in there. And then once both sides of the connector are up like that, you can gently pull this cable out to disconnect it, and then make sure you reseal that. And that is how you disconnect the two rear connectors here. And then once the connectors are off, we can go ahead and disconnect this piece from the base shell by removing a screw from here, here, and here. But be very careful with this screw towards the back here. As you can see, the ribbon cable for the side button is right next to it, so you do need to be a little delicate here, as you can't really pull it out of the way. I'd recommend just kind of putting your screwdriver in at an angle and just kind of pushing it out of the way as best you can, kind of like that, but try not to touch the cable with anything, as you can damage it very easily. Alright, and then with all those screws removed, we can go ahead and just grab this piece and just pull it straight up out of the shell. And this is the entire battery and side button PCB connector here. Now I'll put the base shell off to the side for now, where I want to talk about this a little more in depth. Now, if you're going to patch your side buttons, this is where we're going to do that, as both side buttons do have a bit of a wobbling issue, as you can see here. Now, they're anchoring into the shells rather unique, as you can see, as they're kind of clawed onto the rear of this connector. And to start the patch process, what you need to do is grab a very thin flathead bit, kind of like this one. And what you want to do is you want to take the flathead screwdriver bit and put it into the bottom here and just push in until the buttons pop out of this little holder here. And then once out, you can grab the buttons and just pull them up and off the mouse, but just be very careful when doing this because these little claws on the back of these side buttons are very easy to damage. Just be very careful when doing this. And then once you have that off, you want to go ahead and grab your Scotch tape, and you want to take a very thin piece of tape, ideally something kind of like this, and you want to go ahead and on the back of the connector, you want to put the tape on the back like this, maybe a little lower, kind of like that, and you want to wrap it around the sides so it looks kind of like this. Once that's done, you can take the side buttons and put them here and then just kind of push them back into place with your thumb like that. Now again, if you use very soft tape, this might tear, which won't fix the side button issue. So you want to make sure you have tape that kind of bends when there's a lot of pressure put onto it so it actually fixes the issue. But that will fix the stabilization issue on your side buttons. As you can see here, it's not wobbling nearly as much as it was before. But keep in mind, doing this will of course increase the actuation weight of the side button depending on how much tape you put on here. So be mindful of that. But that's how you patch the side buttons. Now I'm just going to go ahead and take this off for the sake of the teardown video and remove the patch just so we can continue on. But that's everything for this central cage-like support, so we'll put that off to the side. And then looking back at the base of the mouse, next we have to remove this front stabilizer, which as I mentioned earlier is what the main clicks physically hook into, as this tiny little hollow piece on the bottom physically hooks into the little latch towards the top of this connector. And we can remove this quite easily by removing a screw from here and a screw from here. And then once those screws are out, you can remove the piece. Now this piece can be a little finicky sometimes. I find it easiest to grab it on the top here and just gently pull it up, but sometimes it will get kind of caught on the side of the switches. So you may have to use a different method of removing it, but with a little bit of a toying around with it, you should be able to remove the click stabilizer here, and we'll put that off to the side. And then with the stabilizer removed, we can go ahead and remove the main board, but as you can see here, it is held in by these large, tall standoffs here, which means you have to take the board and literally just pull it straight up. Now I'd recommend grabbing by the scroll wheel and just pull straight up and out of the shell just like this. Now when you do this, most likely what will happen is this bottom connector here for the DPI button and the power switch will most likely come off, which I'm just going to go ahead and take it off from my case here, which I will talk about how to reinstall in a moment. And then also on the main board here, we can also remove the scroll wheel. You can just go ahead and grab the scroll wheel and gently pull to the sides to pull it out of the encoder. Just make sure to pull it straight out because it is a magnesium wheel, so it won't bend kind of like plastic wheels. So make sure just to be careful with this so you don't damage your encoder. And then with the scroll wheel removed, that's everything for the main board here, so we'll put that off to the side. And then lastly, we have to go back to the base shell, and there are some mechanical components we do need to remove. Now, if you're just taking your Pathfinder apart to clean it, I would not recommend removing these pieces because they are very difficult to get back in. But if you're going to swap your shell to the Helion Orange shell or another shell that comes out in the future, you will need to remove these components, which can be a little tricky. Now, the easiest way to get all these parts out is to literally turn the mouse over in your hand and just kind of tap the base of the mouse a couple times. And if you've done it correctly, you'll see a couple pieces will come out. So here is the spring for one of these side pieces, so we'll put that off to the side. And then there is also this tiny little indicator here, and that is for the base LED threader, which goes here. So we'll put that off to the side for us to reinstall. Now, sometimes the pieces won't come out, which means you'll have to manually remove them, which can be a little finicky sometimes. And if you do have to manually remove it, what I recommend doing is taking a flathead screwdriver, putting it into the side here, and gently removing the spring. Make sure to keep tabs on this because it has a habit of flying out of the unit. And then doing the exact same with these little pieces here. Kind of fish them out like that. There you go. That's how you take those off. All right, and then once you've removed those mechanical pieces, that is everything for the base shell of the Pathfinder. Again, these pieces can be a little finicky, so just be careful and make sure you don't lose the springs. And now that everything's taken apart, let's go ahead and talk about specifications and board layout next. Alright, first off, we have the central cage-like structure here, which, as I mentioned earlier, has the 300 mAh battery on it, which you can mod out pretty easily, as you can just kind of push or peel the battery off of its base adhesive here, and you can put in a smaller or larger battery if you want. And then we have the side button PCB here with the two Omron switches here. Pretty straightforward here. Again, it is kind of similar to the one Asus had, where the cable is integrated into the actual board itself. So again, be very, very careful with this, as if you damage this, you have to replace this entire side piece. And then on the main board here, it's a pretty standard look here. We We have our TTC 11mm encoder, we have our Omron main switches here, we have our TTC pillar switch. It is a bit of a unique size, but it is a pillar switch as we commonly see. We have our Pixar 3950 sensor here, and we have our Nordic 52840 MCU here. Again, a fairly standard implementation, nothing too crazy with the board, but the board's design is actually quite good and well sized for a modular mouse, which is very impressive. All right, and now that we've talked about specs, let's go ahead and talk about component weights next. Alright, now in terms of weights, as I mentioned in my full review, the Pathfinder does have a pretty wide range scale, being anywhere from like 50 to 60 grams depending on the configuration, but averaging in the 53 to 56 gram range depending on what you're going to do with it. But regardless, for this being a fully modular mouse, the mouse is actually quite light, which is very impressive. Starting off with the base shell with all screws and stock skates removed. It weighs around 11.2 grams. The rear top shell frame weighs around 4.6 grams. The two main clicks collectively weigh 4 grams. The base shell's mechanical components and the filament for the base LED indicator weigh collectively 0.4 grams. The rear shell's mechanical part weighs 1.1 gram. The modular side buttons, this is the 9mm set, weighs 0.7 grams. The side button mounting clamps weigh 0.5 grams. The click stabilizer piece weighs 0.7 grams. The base DPI button housing for the power slider and the power slider itself weighs 0.3 grams. The central cage-like structure with the 300 mAh battery and the side button PCB collectively weighs 8.1 grams, of which the battery is probably 4 to 5 grams. The magnesium scroll wheel weighs 1.6 grams, and the main PCB collectively weighs 9.2 grams. And lastly, all the miscellaneous screws inside the Pathfinder collectively weigh 1.1 gram. And that is everything for the individual component weights for the Pathfinder. Again, overall, considering the mouse's modular nature, the overall weight of this mouse is very impressive. Again, I expected this mouse to be more in the 70-80 gram range, but it being around 53 to 56 grams with most configs and at its heaviest around 59 grams is still a very impressive weight overall. But with components out of the way, let's go ahead and start our reassembly process. First off, we're going to start off with the base shell here, but just to be thorough, I'm actually not going to reassemble the shell with the default base shell. I'm actually going to go ahead and reassemble the mouse with the limited edition Helion Orange core, as well as the magnesium alloy scroll wheel, just to show you guys how to fully reassemble this mouse with an alternative shell if you're going to do so. Now, just a quick note about the alternative shells for the Pathfinder. When you get the alternative shell, the pilot holes for the miscellaneous screws inside the mouse will not be milled out, which means you'll have to manually mill them yourself, which can be a little tricky and a little finicky sometimes. As you can see, it's very easy to overpressure them. So when you do reassemble the mouse, be very careful with how hard you're screwing everything in, because if you screw too hard, you can break these. Now, one thing I did advise Orbital was to take these metal threaders and apply them to all the screw holes on the mouse just to ensure this wasn't an issue, specifically with the main clicks here. As you can see, they've strained a lot. So if you do have one of the alternative shells, just be mindful if you get one of the alternative shells to be careful of how much you're screwing all these screws. Again, if you over tension them, you could break something. So every single screw on this mouse, including the main clicks, just screw them in until you feel a little bit of feedback. Do not over screw the screws. All right, and then with that little disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and put this top shell piece off to the side for later, and let's focus on the base first. Now, the first thing we're going to have to do is reassemble the base shell's mechanical component, which can be very tricky as we have these very tiny sliders here that need to go back into their spots on the base shell. Now, this is going to be really hard to show just because I have such big hands, but how you want to orient these is you want to orient them with the longer prong going to the outside of the mouse. You want this longer prong facing outward and the shorter one inward, and you want to put these in where this little top pointy part faces the top and the bottom of the shell. You do not want to have it facing inward like this. Now, if you have very small hands, you should be able to get them in with your fingers, but since I have such large hands, I'm going to use some tweezers for this. But basically, you just want to put it in, and you want to gently drop it into this little slider right here. You may have to angle it in just like that. So it should sit in like that. And then we'll do the same for the opposite side here. Now, I'd recommend putting in the top ones first. As you can see, they can be a little finicky sometimes to get in because it's very precise. So you want to put them in just like that. And then once you have these top two ones in, next you have the fun part of these little springs. Now, the springs are tricky to say the least, and there's two ways I've found to put them in. Either A, you can put the spring into the holder now, and then take a screwdriver, hold it in place like this, and then take your other hand and put in the other side of this slider piece like that, and then very gently release it and put it into place like that. But you need to be really careful because you can easily pull the spring out, which is kind of a pain. So you have to be careful with doing that. Or you can do the other method where you put in the other slider right away, and then you take the screw and you physically put the screw and you kind of squeeze it down like this, kind of like that, and you want to drop it into the slot with the help of a screwdriver, which is less useful, I've found. I found either way, you usually have to use a screwdriver or something to get them into place. And it can be very difficult if your screwdriver is magnetized, as you can see. So you're going to have to kind of play around and find what method works best for you. Again, personally speaking, I found it's much easier just to remove the component entirely and put them in like I did earlier, but you can use whatever method you want. Just be sure not to damage the springs on these, because again, they are very important. If you damage these, your modular components will not be able to anchor. So you do need to be a little careful when doing this, but just find whatever system works for you. And once you get them installed, again, just be very careful to make sure the spring doesn't make a run for it. And you should be good to go. All right, and then now we have the modular components, and let's go ahead and work on the base power switch next. Now the power switch and the GPI are on the same little plastic piece here, and then we have the removable power switch here, which just slots into the base like this. But know how on the base connector it is kind of oriented to one side. You want to put it into the base shell to orient it like so it should look just like that. And then once it's installed, you can go ahead and just gently put it into the base shell here. Now you may have to play around with the placement a little bit to get it right, because it can be a little finicky sometimes, because the power button does not like to sit still, as you've probably noticed. So you may need to play around with it a little bit, but after a little bit of finicking around with it, you should be able to get it into place. And once you got it in, just go ahead, flip your unit over and verify it still works. And we're going to go ahead and put it into the lowest most position just like that. And once that's installed, make sure you grab the little filament piece with the bottom DPI indicator, and you want to slot that right into this little hole right here, so it should sit in just like that. And then once that's in, we can go ahead and mount the main board. But before we do that, we do have to reinstall the scroll wheel, which for in this case is going to be the gunmetal one that's included with the healer and orange core, which is very easy to do. Is all you do is take the thin part of this and put it into the hole in the encoder. But again, since it is magnesium, it does not have that give of plastic wheels, so just be careful and don't pressure it too hard, as you could break your encoder. But you can just gently slide it into the mouse and just put it into the encoder just like that, and it is installed nice and easy. Now we can go ahead and take this entire thing and put it into the base shell here, but before we do so, we do need to make note of this small little power indicator on the bottom here, as it is a little slider switch, which corresponds to the little button on the bottom here. Now, as I've said in many teardowns before this one, this is very delicate, so you need to be very, very careful with this. So see how it is in the off indicator towards the base? You have to go flip your shell over and make sure it is in the bottom position like this. Now, just keep in mind, if you flip the unit over, this little filament may pop out again, so make sure you reinstall that, just like that. And then once this is in the bottom position, again, verify that this is in the bottom position as well, and you can go ahead and reinstall the board by just aligning it with these little standoffs on the board here and dropping it right into place just like that. Now, if you've oriented everything correctly, the board will sit completely flat, but if it doesn't sit completely flat, it's kind of tilted up towards the back here, it's most likely because the power slider and the button itself isn't oriented. So take the board off and reorient it, and make sure when you flip your mouse over, you can still actuate the side button, and it should look like this. It shouldn't be sinking kind of into the shell. It should be close to the surface just like it is now. All right, and then once your board is installed properly, we can go ahead and anchor it to the base by reinstalling the click stabilizer here, which we can just gently slot over the front of the clicks, kind of like that. It should sit roughly like this, and make sure it's sitting even. Now, you do need to be very careful with this piece here, as if you over tension the anchoring screws, you can cause this to warp a little bit, causing the clicks to feel inconsistent. So as I said earlier, make sure you screw these in to feel a little bit of feedback from the screws. Do not over tension these under any circumstances. Now with that installed, make sure it's sitting roughly even like this. If you notice it's sitting uneven here, untension the screws to make sure it's sitting flat. And I would also recommend putting it on a flat surface and make sure it doesn't wobble. This isn't the greatest surface for it, I'm just going to put it on my table. But make sure it's sitting flat and it doesn't have any wobbling to it, because again, if you over tension this, not only will you mess up the main click, you can also make the base of the shell uneven. But once that's tensioned in, the board is secured, and then we can go ahead and reinstall this cage-like structure here. Now again, if you're going to tape mod your side buttons, make sure to put the tape on the back of the portion right here, wrap it around, and then install it into the side shell. And you can do this by taking the clamps and putting them over the edges like this, get it roughly lined up into the connector, and just push in just like that. And we'll do the same for the next one. So up and over like that, and into the connector. Nice and easy. And then once that's done, we can go ahead and drop this entire structure into the main board here. And the easiest way to do this is to line up these two back standoffs here with these two standoffs here, drop it into place just like that. It should sit completely flat, so if you press down there shouldn't be any kind of wobbling or teetering to it. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and install the 3 anchoring screws, and again make sure you don't over tension them. And then once those are installed, just go ahead again, verify your base is sitting completely flat, which it is, so we're good to go. And then we can go ahead and re-anchor our connectors, which we can do pretty easily by simply pulling up the sides of this connector here. You want to put it into the open position, just like that, and then you can just gently feed this cable in through the top, sit it in roughly like that. You want to sit like that, and then just take your fingernails and just gently clip it into place, just like that. And then you can take the JST connector and do the same thing. Put it in like that, and then just gently press it down. But make sure your battery cables aren't sitting out like this. You want to make sure they're sitting more towards the rear of the shell like this. And the same goes for the side button cable here. You want to make sure they're out of the way of this section here, which we'll talk about why in a moment. Now, before you move on, I recommend flipping your mouse over, turning it on, and verify that everything works. So check your side buttons, check your scroll wheel click, check your main clicks, which you can do by taking a screwdriver and just gently pressing on the inside here. A flathead bit works easiest. Make sure the sensor works. Make sure everything is good before you go forward. If your side buttons aren't working, it's most likely because this ribbon cable isn't in all the way. So just take this off and reseat it. Make sure it's sitting completely flat. But once you've verified everything is working, you can go ahead, turn your unit off. You can reinstall your side buttons now if you would like, which you can just clip onto the sides here. And that is everything for the base shell here. We'll put this off to the side for now. And now we can work on the top shell next. Alright, now the top shell here for the Pathfinder is going to be pretty straightforward, as the only thing we really have to do is reinstall these main clicks here. But because we are using an alternative shell, again, these screw holes are a little finicky sometimes. And because of this, what I recommend doing is actually anchoring in the support screws for the main clicks before you install the clicks. Screw them in about halfway, that way you don't have any risk of them potentially going in sideways or something like that, or damaging a threader. So make sure you just work in, quote unquote, the pilot holes before you put the clicks back in. Now, since I've already done that, I'm just going to go ahead and re-anchor the main click by just pushing it in just like this, and we'll do the second one, which we can just put into the bottom, into the top, and press down here. Now the tricky part about this is that this entire upper frame is rather fragile, and you do need to put a fair amount of force to actually tension these. So you do need to be kind of careful when you anchor everything in place, and you also need to be sure not to put too much pressure towards the front, as you can knock the main clicks out of their stabilizer. So you have to do a rather delicate install process here, which can be made a little easier by using a microfiber cloth and putting it under the top shell as like a cushioning layer, so there's not so much strain being putting on the top shell here. But once you have everything kind of aligned, you can go ahead and grab your screwdriver and re-anchor the main click, and again, make sure it is sitting completely flat. Make sure to push it in all the way. And as always with all main click screws, make sure not to over tension these, as we did with all the rest of the screws on this mouse. So make sure to screw these in only until you feel a little bit of feedback. Alright, and then once those screws are in, go ahead and grab the top shell and just check the main clicks and see how they're sitting. Now, see how mine are sitting uneven? That is a very bad thing, which means that one of them is under or over tensioned. So I need to go back and just check my tensioning on these. And with a little bit of extra screen, you can see how they're kind of sitting a little more even now, so that's how you want them to be. And then once that's done, that's everything for the top shell, and you can basically just hook this back into the main shell pretty easily. And all you need to do for this is see these little hooks here. Those are going to correspond to these little hooks here and here. So you have to take the top shell and kind of hook them in, so to speak. You have to hook in the clicks, which can be a little finicky. You may have to do it a couple times to get them in properly, but with enough pressure, you should be able to hook them into place. And once you get them kind of hooked in, you can just grab the shell, press down, and anchor it into place just like this. Now, before you go on, make sure, again, your main clicks are sitting completely flat, and make sure they have a rebound to them. So they should have a nice kind of snappy rebound to them, and of course, make sure your clicks still function. And just double check to make sure all the shell is sitting completely flat, so make sure everything is flush, which it is. And then once that's done, we can go ahead and reassemble the rear mechanical piece, which is pretty easy to do. Firstly, you're going to go ahead and grab the tiny screw we took out earlier and put it on the end of a screwdriver, and just put it into the center of this little structure, so you can see how it goes into the center like that. And then you can take this point structure, which is very similar to the ones we saw on the side of the mouse, and you want to orient it this way, where there's this little lip facing the rear of the shell, and you can just drop that into place just like that. And then you can grab this piece here, which initially confused me, but you have to put it into the shell like this, with this flat piece going towards the rear. Now, this is why, as I said earlier, you want to make sure the battery cables are out of the way, because they can get caught sometimes. So again, make sure you push them out of the way, and you can just grab the structure and drop it on top just like that. It should sit completely flat. And then you can grab the two anchoring screws and re-anchor it. And then with this rear piece installed, you can then go ahead and put back in your modular components, which we can do quite easily. And with that, you've successfully disassembled and reassembled a Pathfinder, as well as patched your side buttons or swapped your mouse's shell to the limited edition ones. Overall, the experience here with the Pathfinder, as I said in my full review, is very good. Again, I did not expect this mouse to be so serviceable given its modular nature, as previous attempts at modular mice were very rough around the edges to say the least, but this mouse has a lot of fantastic repairability options, and again, it is highly moddable. So if you want to swap out the battery or the shell components or do pretty much whatever you want to this mouse, you can do so very easily, which is a great thing to see. So again, massive props to the Orbital team. They've done a fantastic job with the overall design of this mouse, its overall performance, and of course the serviceability, and obviously the modular nature of the mouse is fantastic as well. And if you did miss my full review of the Pathfinder, be sure to go check that video out as I talk in depth all about the pros and cons and all the unique features of the Pathfinder. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of Breakdown. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks again to Orbital for sending over the Pathfinder for review. I greatly appreciate it. And if you enjoyed the teardown video, want to see more videos like this, and of course more in-depth reviews, consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, and members make videos like this one possible. But that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode. Peace.